Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. This is a replacement show for one that is going to be postponed, and I've been in touch with Britain. It's a misunderstanding. Anyway, Masters of the Air dropped yesterday. The new Apple TV Spielberg Hanks third series following the epic Band of Brothers in the Pacific, and I watched the first two episodes last night. I may try and watch them again, possibly tonight. We'll see. And I thought about doing a show this afternoon covering what my reactions were, but hey, I'm doing it now anyway. So first things first, obviously a lot of money's been spent on it. I also should stress that John Orloff, the writer of the show, will be on World War II TV probably in March to discuss how he put the story together. 10 years, essentially, he worked on the script, and we'll be discussing how he used his sources, what he was trying to achieve, etc., etc., etc. There may be some spoilers, so if you haven't seen it yet, I may allude to things that I noticed or how the story will develop. There you are, spoiler alert. And I'm also going to say right at the beginning, I'm very positive about anything that highlights what was achieved by the World War II greatest generation, which is a phrase I don't particularly like, but in this context, I think it works perfectly. So I'm not one of those people who looks for faults. I go into these things very, very open-minded, expecting there to be adaptations, compromises made for a modern audience. It's not a documentary. I'm probably the kind of audience viewer that has a higher amount of knowledge about the subject than perhaps some viewers, so it's not necessarily aimed at me. Don't forget, for those who don't know, I grew up in 8th Air Force country in East Anglia. My teenage bicycle routes took me within about, with about 3 bases were within a few miles of where I lived. So I grew up cycling around perimeter tracks, going to old bomb dumps, looking at control towers, and probably the first veterans outside of my own family I met or saw were 8th Air Force veterans returning to the UK. So I'm unashamedly interested in the 8th Air Force, but I'm not an expert. So my first reactions are about, let's talk about the computer effects. I think that's the elephant in the room. Clearly, you can't do the kind of authentic filming they did back in the 1940s with films like 12 O'Clock High, where they got a number of flying B-17s. They had to rely on computer effects and full size replicas that they had on airfields. So, those who are expecting to see lots and lots of genuine airworthy aircraft, flying over Europe, that was never going to happen. And I wonder whether some of the people who have been critical of the computer animation, the CGI, are people who because they know it's computer effects, are looking for faults with it. And I watched it on my pretty large TV. I thought it looked fine. There was one crash, I think, in episode 1 or episode 2 that I thought looked a little bit not rushed, but it looked a little bit kind of false to me. But then I've never actually seen a B-17 crash, so I don't know. Maybe I'm judging it by the kind of stunt flying back in these old movies, and maybe what the filmmakers with Masters of the Air were trying to achieve is actually more accurate. And I've seen lots and lots of critical comments on Facebook and Twitter saying, why don't they consult pilots? Why don't they consult historians? Why don't they do this? Well, of course they consult historians. Of course they consult people. Just people I know on Facebook who contributed props to the series, bandage wrappers, things like that. Of course they went to extraordinary lengths to get things right. I mean, one of the comments or gripes I saw was about the hair length, right? And I just had a look through some of my photos. Hair length amongst air crews in the 8th Air Force varied. Now, because the series didn't show any training, it may go back. There may be some flashbacks later on in the series to showing them, navigation school or flight school. I don't know, but they're meant to be months, if not years, into their service with the US Army Air Force. And if you look at the photos of the air crews in England in 1943, 1944, some have massive, great coils of hair on their head under their hats, and it was kind of combed back in the rear like a kind of an Elvis cut. And obviously, the other elephant in the room is Austin Butler, who plays one of the characters, Bucky. He Captain Gale, I forgot the surname is, but Bucky. he'd just come off the Baz Luhrmann Elvis film, and he'd been 3 years in character developing the Elvis accent. And I noticed he did sound a little bit like Elvis in that first episodes, but you know, I went with it. And if you look at the photos, these guys have long hair. Some of them, they have big sort of swooping kind of, you know, and on their head, it's the old British Army thing. What's under your hat is yours. What the army can see is theirs. So I have no problem with the hair length. Another gripe I saw on Facebook is there's not enough people smoking. And I'm like, oh, for goodness sake, you know, it's 2024. The last thing we need to do is make smoking seem attractive on screen. So, of course, the filmmakers are limiting how much smoking is on screen. Yes, we know that generation smoked hugely and the smoking was commonplace, but I have no problem that they reduce the amount of smoking, even though it's not, quote unquote, authentic to you know, to have had more smoking. So those kind of things annoy me when people are just looking for reasons to criticize it. Now, one of the things I am intrigued about is how they're going to develop the character development is going to carry on through the 9 episodes, because I don't want to spoil things. A couple of the characters they've already set up, in fact 3 of the characters they've set up, can't be in all 9 episodes in the air, shall we say. I don't want to say any more than that. And by the way, in terms of sources, obviously Masters of the Air is based on this book by Donald Miller. I have a signed copy. I've met Donald Miller a couple of times, but another important source text, and I will speak to John Orloff, the writer, in March about the other source text to use, was this one here, A Wing and a Prayer by Harry Crosby. Now, he is the if you have seen the show, he's the vomiting navigator you saw a lot in episodes 1 and 2. His book, A Wing and a Prayer, about the Bloody 100th Bomb Group, is an absolute classic. I managed to pick up a signed copy. It's not signed to me; it's signed to the previous owner, but it's signed by Harry Crosby there. And so that's an important text there. So one of the criticisms of the Pacific was you didn't have that continuity of characters all the way through the 10 parts as the Pacific was, and they're going to struggle a little bit in some senses to have that continuity of characters through in Masters of the Air, because if you know anything about either the 8th Air Force or 15th Air Force or Bomber Command, tours often were tragically cut short by people being killed. I mean, that is one of the main stories of the 8th Air Force, is the incredible losses these guys took. So you don't get many people who were there in early 1943 when the 8th Air Force is setting up, who were still there in the spring of 1945 when they're still bombing Germany. You get some ground crew people, you get some people in kind of the commanding officer, adjutant, intelligence officer roles, but flyers, it's very unusual to have anybody who went through that length of the war there. So I'm intrigued to know, and I've looked at the cast list, and there are some key characters that have not been shown on screen yet, Rosie Rosenthal being one of them, who will obviously come into play later on. So I'm intrigued to know how they will develop that as it goes on. I know a few people who have watched all the episodes. They were given preview links to watch. I could have asked for that. I didn't. I wanted to be like the rest of the world and watch it on a big screen when it came out, and have my reactions kind of honest like everybody else's. So the computer effects didn't bother me. I thought it was very well done. The hair, ages, all that stuff didn't bother me. The music, I think, was quite good. Yost just made an interesting point there about the sound mix, because I had the subtitles on so Mag can understand. And one of my old man complaints about modern TV shows is the sound balance is sometimes always all over the place. Sometimes I have problems listening to dialogue in TV shows. And I understand the problem these days is that people are watching TV on all sorts of different devices. Some are watching it on their phones with headphones, some are watching it on big screens, some are watching it on small screens, and there's no one default kind of sound mix modern filmmakers can have that's going to be perfect for everybody. So some people, if they listen to headphones, perhaps the dialogue is clearer. So I did find some of the dialogue a bit muffled, and maybe I'm in agreement with you, Yost. I think some of the noise of the aircraft didn't maybe sound as thunderous as I'd like it to be. Maybe they're building up, because we haven't seen any massive 1,000 bomber raids yet in the series. We're going to get up to Schweinfurt and things like Schweinfurt later on in the series, and maybe that's when we'll hear this big roar, kind of representing the huge number of B-17s and later on B-24s that were flying into Germany. So the sound mix is a kind of a poison chalice for modern filmmakers, because everybody's preferences and how they watch things is so different. So, I have some sympathy for getting it right there, but I found having the subtitles on, I was reading the subtitles sometimes to understand. Now, authenticity wise, I'm not going to go into, I'm not an aircraft geek, but the 100th Bomb Group were equipped with the later type B-17Fs. And from what I understand, they were very accurate in the film, in the series. They had the right oxygen masks and the right gear. And I like the fact they showed the guys suiting up with the heated suits. I really like the fact they explained the dangers of frostbite and exposure at high altitude. I think a lot of films in the past have never really covered that. Clearly, there's some cliche stuff that comes into movies about the 8th Air Force. And you may have seen on my Facebook page or Twitter that kind of 8th Air Force bingo card of cliches that will come up, like, landing on one wheel, and will we get back in, and I can't leave anybody behind, those kind of things. And any World War II film is going to incorporate certain amounts of tropes and cliches, because that's how the stories are told. Like my shows on World War II TV use certain phrases again and again and again, because they are the realities of what we're talking about. So yeah, I think there were some things that could be identified as cliches, but I also think, and this is the important part about this review I wanted to do, is the criticism I've seen the most on social media the last 12 hours or so is about the 8th Air Force compared to the RAF methods, the doctrine. Okay. The RAF bombing by night, area bombing, the Americans bombing by day, supposedly precision bombing. And the criticism I've seen from British people, I'm British obviously myself, is of the pub scene, where the 8th Air Force guys are kind of arrogantly saying how what they're doing is better than what the RAF have been doing. But I think that's people are seeing something that isn't there. There was rivalry, friendly rivalry between the British and Americans, and both nations, as the series in fact said, the narration said, were believed that their method was the correct one. And both Bomber Command and 8th Air Force kind of morphed and molded their doctrine as the war went on. And all that, I think what was being shown in those first 2 episodes is that the Americans have this confidence in the Northern bomb site and confidence in their method, but they haven't had much action yet. This pub conversation is happening when they've only been on 1 or 2 missions. And the RAF guys, I think they deliberately chose to have older RAF guys to imply they've been around the block. Maybe these guys have been fighting and flying since 1939, 1940. And they're kind of observing these Americans being a bit arrogant and being a bit confident about their methods. And the narration, and this is what people are criticizing, the narration is by, and if you've read my Twitter post, you've already seen this, the narration is by one of the 8th Air Force 100th Bomb Group flyers. So he is talking about it as if in present tense. He's there at the time. This isn't a narration by a historian with 80 years of understanding of air warfare. This is a narration by someone at the time. So, of course, the guy is explaining how the 8th Air Force method is the best, and that because the same thing happened in Rogue Heroes, a series about the SAS. The SAS were talking about how good they were. You've seen it on my channel when an expert like Mia was on last night talking about the Rangers. He's a former Ranger, so of course he's going to be complimentary about the Rangers. Of course he's going to say they're one of the finest. That goes without saying. So I don't think this was set up to make to poke fun at the British. I think if you look at it in a clever way, this pub scene was actually the reverse. The pub scene was actually showing the RAF guys sitting, being quite reserved, listening to these American air crews talking about how their method was the better one. And then when you saw the mission into Trondheim, into Norway, and the one that happened before that, and they're unable to release their bombs because the cloud cover was there. It's being shown. You're being shown on screen that the bombing doctrine wasn't working in 1943. And for anybody who's chatted to me in person over the last year or so, when I knew this series was coming out, and apologies, I'm not reading all your comments because I'm talking to you, is that I always was wondering how they were going to cover with this series the fact that the 8th Air Force was not the finished article when it started. Neither was Bomber Command, neither was Airborne Forces, neither was Tank Infantry Combined Arms. The Allies, and if you know this because you watch my channel, got better at doing everything. And the arc of the 8th Air Force's story, I think, is that the basic principle of strategic bombing being a key asset in winning the war had been established in the 1930s. Exactly how to achieve and how to use strategic bombing was subject to different nations having different views about it, and was subject to the Germans having a say. The ability of flak, the German aircraft being very good at what they did, the night fighters that were attacking the British, and the Fokker-Wolves and the Messerschmitts attacking the Americans, etc., etc., etc. So everybody had to learn on the job what methods of bombing worked. And people are going to say you're being too simplistic about this now, Woody. But basically, the Americans kind of dropped off a little bit from their precision bombing idea to adopt a slightly more area bombing idea. And the British kind of moved the other way, where they, as they got better at things and they had technology that was suiting them and radar assisted this, and the other, blah, 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 they kind of moved from area towards precision as the war went on. So as the war went on, basically, in my non-aviation expert understanding, both nations, both methods kind of became the same one. People say, oh, no, it's not that complicated. No, it's not that simple. But, I'm trying to make a point here by the series has to show that the 8th Air Force got better at things. And then while it was learning, this is when the loss of life is happening. And for those who don't know, the American 8th Air Force was the biggest single killer of American combat personnel in World War II. More 8th Air Force personnel died than Marines, the Navy. It was incredibly costly, and the same pretty much applies to Bomber Command for the British and Dominion and Commonwealth forces. The losses in Bomber Command were crazy. So I was worried that this series was going to show American success right off from episode 1 and 2. Now, what they're doing is they're showing American confidence. As I said, the pilots would have gone into this believing that they were part of the best system because they've been trained very well. The American navigation schools, the pilot schools, all the training and flights they did were very, very good. And then as the series actually showed, because the first guy who gets there, he's been there a few weeks ahead of the second guy. And when the second guy gets there and does his first flight, he says to the first guy, why didn't you tell me it was going to be like that? They're telling you, the audience, that their expectations of how it was going to go in the air were not met by reality, that the reality was going to be a lot tougher. The losses were going to be high. And I think it's showing that. I think, and this is where I'm going to give the filmmakers or the series makers all the credit, is they are not spoon feeding you every idea, that they are allowing you, the audience, to kind of listen to the dialogue and understand that dialogue is in some ways contradicting what you're seeing on screen, in that they are showing that these young cocky pilots, but they're also showing that the methods aren't working yet. And then I assume as the series goes on, the success will improve and the accuracy will improve and the loss rates will drop. And I don't know whether it's going to end in 44 or 45. I know nothing about where the series is going. So that's my kind of thoughts on that. The other thing I want to kind of talk about is this balancing act that modern filmmakers do with providing a series that is enjoyable for a broad audience, but also suitable for geeks like ourselves. Okay. And it's a hard line to get to balance that. Even with what I do on this channel, when I'm doing a show, I think, is that too much detail for some people? Is it not enough detail for some others? And the reality is every single show I do is going to be not fulfilling everybody. Some people are going to be lost by it being too complicated, and others are going to be, oh, come on, Woody, we know this stuff. That's inevitable because we all have such different understandings of history and different understandings of a nuance. I was chatting with my Australian mate Warwick last night, who's a filmmaker, and we talk about lots of World War II things. He hasn't read any of the books about the 100th Bomb Group, so he's going into this blind. Now, if it was a show about other aspects of World War II, he would have much more prior knowledge. So even individuals have areas that we're strong at and areas that we're weak at. And, as I said at the beginning, I know a little bit about the 8th Air Force. So I went into this with perhaps more background knowledge than Mag did. So the series has to try and fit and appeal to everybody. And it's a hard thing to achieve. And when I speak to John Orloff, the writer in March, that's going to be one of the things that I will ask him, what's the trade-off? What's the trade-off for getting all the military details right, but making it understandable for a broad audience? And the next bit's going to seem a bit a bit bitchy, really. But I do wonder, some of my friends on Facebook and Twitter who are self-confessed war buffs, history buffs, military buffs like myself, is in some ways why they even bother to watch these shows. You know, Rogue Heroes came out, some people just dumped on that. This has come out, people are dumping on that. Dunkirk, they dump on that. Well, why watch then? What I don't understand sometimes people's attitude of looking for reasons to dislike something. For me, yeah, John Orloff wrote 2 of the Band of Brothers episodes. I think it was numbers 2 and then Why We Fight. He wrote Lorelei. So, you know, it comes down to understanding there are documentaries, there are feature films, there are books, there are video games, and all of those will be a means of showing history to people in different ways, and they have to find this balancing point where it's broad enough for most people, but also detailed enough for the experts. So there we are. That's where I am with this. I'm really excited about seeing the next episodes. The fact we saw 2 in the one night, and the time flew by. I mean, we watched the 2 episodes. It seemed like we'd spent half an hour, and the 2-hour-long episodes just zipped by. And I'm frustrated that only one a week for the next few weeks. Will I maybe not watch anything for 2 or 3 weeks and then watch 2 or 3 episodes in one splurge? I don't know. I really liked it, and I think it can only be good for the understanding of history. Now, that said, I hope it sheds a spotlight on the 9th Air Force and the 15th Air Force and Bomber Command and the 2nd Tactical Air Force. I hope people don't just stick with the 100th Bomb Group, because there are lots of other incredible air units flying into Germany. They're flying in from Italy. If you watched the show with James Holland yesterday, he was talking about after the Salerno and Anzio landings, the importance of getting the airfields near Foggia so that the Air Force can start flying there from Germany. That's an incredibly important air war aspect. The flying out of other islands in the Mediterranean, Catch 22, that important part of taking the war to Germany. So I really do think that the people who are attracted by this understanding and portrayal of the 8th Air Force will broaden out and read some other things and watch some other things. Interesting, Phil, that you thought the Pacific was awful. I wasn't intending to talk about the Pacific. When the Pacific came out, I didn't enjoy it. I found it difficult to get into. It didn't have the same magic for me as Band of Brothers, and I went into it with very high expectations. I'd read some of the books it was based on, Robert Leckie's book. Of course, I'd read Eugene Sledge's book when I was a teenager. Henry Sledge, Eugene Sledge's son, has been on World War II TV a few times. And when it came out, I was underwhelmed by it. I find it difficult to get into. Weirdly, though, well, perhaps not weirdly, in the whatever it is, 15 years since the Pacific came out, I've grown to really appreciate it. I've grown to realize exactly what they were trying to get across. I've understood and spoken to some actors from it and people behind it. And one of the things they were absolutely trying to get across is the Pacific campaign wasn't like the European campaign. There were no liberation parades through towns with grateful local girls, waving and giving flag. The Pacific campaign was brutal and turned normal men, so to speak, into almost monsters because of the horror and that's what the Pacific did. So I started off being an absolute Band of Brothers fan. I'm still an absolute Band of Brothers fan, but now each time I watch it, Band of Brothers, it's a slightly diminishing return because I'm very familiar with it now, and I still love it. But the Pacific, each time I watch that or watch clips of it, it's moving up in my expectations. So I think the same thing in some senses will apply to Masters of the Air, and I've been hating how all the advertising has been talking about it as a sequel to Band of Brothers in the Pacific. I mean, it's only a sequel in the sense that it's made by the basic same executive producer team. So I mean, you've got filmmakers back in the past who make a Western one year and then they do a horror film a year later. It doesn't mean they're sequels. It just means that the team behind it are from the same company. And so I've disliked that understanding, that way of portraying or advertising the Masters of the Air as being a sequel. Band of Brothers was lightning in a jar, wasn't it? It hit everybody at exactly the right time. The veterans were alive. We got to speak and hear with listen to Dick Winters and Bill Garnier and Carwood Lipton. It hit America. Episode 1 and 2 were around the time of 9/11. The country was in a particular moment back then. It reached out to patriotism, and Band of Brothers, was magic. The Pacific, lots of expectations for the Pacific, and there've been lots of expectations for Masters of the Air. But for me, I so far, based on the 2 episodes I've seen, I really liked it. There's a couple of little things that maybe I would change a couple of little things in terms of, again, some sort of slightly cliched things, but that they are tiny, minor, microscopic gripes compared to what I think is going to be a fantastically important TV series that is going to really put a spotlight on the concept of strategic bombing. And I'm just going to say to people, kind of don't be judgmental and don't take everything from the dialogue. As I said earlier, the dialogue is part of the story. Watch what's happening on screen as well. Because I said the arrogance of these pilots is understandable. That's how all men are trained to believe they're the best in the best unit. So there we are. I think it's definitely worth a watch. I wonder whether it will have another vigoration when it goes onto other platforms, because I know a lot of people who just didn't want to get Apple TV for this. I wasn't sure I wanted to get Apple TV. I got it, and before Masters of the Air came on, I binge watched Ted Lasso over a couple of weeks and loved that. And there's been a couple of other things on Apple TV I've really liked. So whether I will keep on with Apple TV long term, I don't know, but I'm absolutely going to keep on going with it until the end of this series, because I think I'm going to give it, based on 2 episodes, a woody solid 9.5 out of 10, which I think is pretty high standards. I'm going to leave it at that. And as David O'Keefe just said, it's very good, but it's entertainment at the end of the day. Exactly. It's good entertainment. Don't go to Masters of the Air to learn about the 8th Air Force, although you will, by osmosis, learn about the 8th Air Force. Just to finish off, I went and bothered into the other room and got a couple of books. There's stacks of books about the 8th Air Force. I didn't pick up my Roger Freeman books. If you don't know who Roger Freeman was, back in the 70s, he was the UK's leading 8th Air Force expert. He, plotted all where the airfields were. He wrote the Mighty 8th, the Mighty 8th War Diary, the Mighty 8th War Manual. Those are indispensable books if you want to understand the 8th Air Force, but they were too heavy to bring in a room. So I mentioned the books. Masters of the Air, obviously, Donald Miller is what it's based on. It covers the whole concept of 8th Air Force from their inception through to their final weeks, blah, blah, blah. It's a good book. And again, the Harry Crosby, it's not really an autobiography. He talks about himself, but he's talking about the 100th Bomb Group. A Wing and a Prayer, fantastic book. Can't recommend it enough. She was on the show. Frank Murphy's granddaughter Chloe was on the show a few weeks ago. Luck of the Drawback, Frank Murphy. He's a character in the series. He hasn't appeared yet. I read this in about 3 days when I was on holiday in August. Absolutely fantastic read. This is a kind of preview to, media copy that most of them come hardback. But Luck of the Draw, fantastic book. Another harking back to another World War II TV show. Damn Lucky, about John Lucky Luckadoo. He came on the show with Kevin Maurer. John was at one of the premieres in the USA 3 or 4 days ago, and he said to John Orloff, so John Lucky Luckadoo said to John Orloff, it was like flying another mission with my friends, something like that, having watched the series. And he was in the 100th Bomb Group. He knew the guys who were being portrayed. I think that's high praise. If a veteran says to the writer, you kind of got it right and you made me feel like I was there, that's good. And although it's about a different bomb group, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Mike Bingley and Paul Bingley and Mike Peters' fantastic book, Bomb Group, about the 381st. They were on my channel again sometime last year. And people say, you're always doing these shameless plugs for your friends. And I'm like, yeah, yeah. What's wrong with that? I'm biased. It's my channel. These are my friends. They're their books, but they're worth reading. So there we are. There's lots more books coming up in the sidebar there. So I'm going to leave it at that. I might do another one of these a few weeks in, but keep an eye out in March when I have John Orloff on, the writer. I'm really looking forward to that. Who knows? I've asked. Maybe I'll get an actor or two on to talk to them. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. That's not my priority. I want to speak to the writer. I know John had spent 10 years working on this. And I think at one point he told me that he'd read something like 200 8th Air Force books, just in the prep for this. So this isn't some, jobbing TV writer who gets given a job to write a script about, I don't know, gangland 1930s and just bashes out a script over a weekend. This is a guy who has spent 10 years working on this to get across to a modern audience what he wanted to get across. Now, I've been intrigued to know from him what it was he was trying to get across, whether he thinks he managed to get it across, and what he thinks the reaction to this series has been. Because like anybody else writing a book or creating a piece of art, you think you've got it to where it's no one would ever say it's perfect, but you've got to a point where you've kind of handed it over, and then the public judge you. And some movies do well, and some movies flop. Some books do well, and some books flop. And I've been intrigued to know whether the critical reception to Masters of the Air is in line with what John Orloff was hoping. But I'm going to say right now, again, one more time, it's absolutely worth seeing. It's absolutely worth getting Apple TV for. It's not Band of Brothers. It's not trying to be a Band of Brothers. It's something very different. The continuity of characters, as I said earlier, will possibly be a bit of a challenge to have characters all the way through the 9 episodes. The 10th episode is going to be an interview with veterans. And I think people who knew some of the veterans and kind of, analyze it from that point of view. So there we are. Good points, Scott. John Orloff should publish his research. And I think that's the thing. I know some people have been critical of Masters of the Air. Friends of mine with podcasts have been quite critical of it. I think John Orloff is a historian, as well as being a scriptwriter. He certainly got into this with a historian's mindset, but he has to also work with the fact that Apple have put whatever it is, 200 million in this or something, and it's got to hit all these parameters. It's got to be popular. It's got to make money. So John has had to work with that. But we'll talk to him in March. Anyway, I'm gonna leave it now. I thought it was great. I'll be in touch with Prit. It's just a misunderstanding. I'll reschedule it sometime, maybe tonight, but I don't think tonight. I think we're going to have pizza here in Woody Mag Towers, and maybe tomorrow, but I don't think tomorrow. More likely Tuesday. I'm just scheduling a show for Monday. There's one Monday. Alex Sagba-Brady's coming on. He was Francis Mellitt in Band of Brothers. He's coming on to talk about a charity project, a documentary about the bond the actors went through making that series. That's going to be a short show. And then after that, Stephen Fisher's coming on. So if you're Canadian watching this right now, Stephen Fisher is going to debunk probably 99% debunk that was Juno Beach called Jelly Beach before it became Juno Beach. As he said to me on Twitter, you can't actually disprove a negative, but watch that one. It'll be a 20-minute myth-busting show on Monday at 7:45 UK time. At some point, David O'Keefe is going to come on and do some deep myth-busting with me. I don't know when that's going to be. And then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Pacific. Lots of Pacific content coming your way. But basically, I'm going to go now and recover for the fact that Ipswich got knocked out of the FA Cup by non-league Maidstone. But if you're a Maidstone fan, well done. You took us, you took your chances. Ipswich had the possession. But what can I say? 2-1. Well done, Maidstone. I hope you get a really good team in the next round, and I hope you go on, because it was Ipswich weren't at their best. But I'm going to go and see my other half now. Thank you for watching this. I will see you all again next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.